Welcome to the Hoover Institution's Washington, D.C. office. My name is Erin Witcher-Tillman. I'm an associate director here at the Hoover Institution. For those of you who might not be familiar with the work of Hoover, we are a research center based in Palo Alto, California at Stanford University, dedicated to generating policy ideas that promote economic prosperity, national security, and democratic governance. We are very excited tonight to be here to launch the Human Prosperity Project on Socialism and Free Market Capitalism. I'm here with my 5 colleagues who are going to launch the project and tell you about it. Start with Ed Lazier, is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. He was chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors for President George W. Bush. Scott Atlas is also a senior fellow and formerly was the chief of neuroradiology at Stanford University School of Medicine. He's an MD. Neil Ferguson's a senior fellow. He's the author of 15 books, including the most recent, The Square and the Tower. Peter Berkowitz is a senior fellow, and he's the director of the State Department's Department Policy Planning staff for the Office of the Secretary. And John Taylor is a senior fellow and was the undersecretary for Treasury for International Affairs for President George W. Bush, and also served on the CEAs as a senior economist for Presidents Ford and Carter, and also as a member for President George H.W. Bush. And with that, we will open it up to our co-chairs of this project, Ed Lazier and Scott Atlas.
Great. Well, thank you all for coming. And what Scott and I are going to do, just take a couple of minutes to introduce the project to you, and then turn it over to our colleagues who actually have some substantive things to say. So the project, as you know, you've seen what's been going on in the country. There's a lot of discussion right now as to what's the appropriate system going forward. Should we be more capitalist? Should we be more socialist? And by the way, this is not party specific. If you watch the Democratic debate in Nevada, Bernie Sanders declared that he was a democratic socialist, and then Mike Bloomberg said, this is totally ridiculous. We're not going to get rid of capitalism. So even within the Democratic Party, there's certainly a debate on this issue. What Hoover wants to do is to shed light on this by looking at the historical record in a scholarly and academic way, and consider various aspects of socialism, capitalism, and some of the outcomes, try to document that using data, and as I said, making it a scholarly approach. And then those results will be disseminated not only through the scholarly papers, but also through other vehicles like op-eds and other forms of communication. So our goal, again, is to shed light on this, but to shed light on it in a way that is credible, serious, and objective. And that's what we hope to do over the next 9 months to a year. That's the target for the project. So let me turn it over to Scott. He'll give you a little bit more detail on what we actually have in mind.
Thanks, Eddie. Of course, as we know, and Eddie just said, this is sort of the issue of the day, and we view it as a core, a really fundamental part of what the Hoover Institution stands for. In a scholarly way, we will address a variety of topics, not just economic prosperity, but as you see, the title of the project is the Human Prosperity Project, which involves things like individual freedoms and rights and opportunities that are all, of course, inherent and also related to economic freedom. Just to go through some of the specific topics that will be ongoing, we envision for at least this year, but probably this is an issue of permanence in the discussion of the United States. We'll have fellows such as Ayaan Hirsi Ali talking about and writing about individual liberty from the perspective of comparing these economic societal models. And we'll have Larry Diamond talk about the importance of democracy and freedom in governance. Victor Davis Hanson will talk about the historical context, as will my colleagues up on this stage as our launch of Neil Ferguson and Peter Berkowitz. We'll have H.R. McMaster talk about the relationship of the civilians as part of society to the military part of society and the role of these various models in international relations. John Taylor, who's also here, will be talking about macroeconomic policy. We have Eddie and Leo Hanian coming out with papers on economic jobs, job creation, income mobility, et cetera. So there will be a variety of issues. all of which are very core and substantial. And we'll be talking about these, as Eddie said, through both scholarly papers and derivative written publications and a whole host of web-based electronic media productions.
Thanks, Scott. Neil and Peter published our first two papers, and so Neil, as our historian, we'll start with you on your paper, Capitalism, Socialism, and Nationalism, Lessons from History.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. I thought socialism was dead. I had danced on its grave most happily between the years 1989 and 1991, and it really came as something of a shock to me that I even had to write a paper like this. It sent me back to Joseph Schumpeter, whose Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy was published back in 1942. And in that book, Schumpeter asked two very fundamental questions. First, can capitalism survive? To which his answer was no. And secondly, can socialism work? To which his answer was, of course it can. And the reason it's worth quoting those words is that Schumpeter, although he was a Harvard professor, and you can all boo if you want, was that almost non-existent creature today, a conservative Harvard professor. And he gave these answers not with any joy, but with considerable sorrow. Why did Schumpeter in 1942 think that capitalism was doomed and socialism was going to prevail? He had four reasons. First, capitalism's inherent propensity for creative destruction, Schumpeter's most famous phrase, made it unpopular because the destructive part somehow pisses people off more than the creative part makes them cheerful. Secondly, he argued capitalism has a tendency towards oligopoly, concentration, rather than competition, and it's quite hard to prevent that turning into monopoly. Thirdly, and this is my favorite part of the argument, he said there's a vested interest in social unrest, namely intellectuals and particularly academics. And finally, he said there'll always be democratic politicians who want to pitch socialism. As Margaret Thatcher says, you can always persuade people to spend other people's money. So these four reasons made Schumpeter pessimistic, as were most right-thinking intellectuals, including Hayek, Mises, and others. At the end of World War II, it did not look at all likely that capitalism would prevail over socialism after the vast expansion of state power that there had been in all economies during the war. It's worth remembering that academics and intellectuals consistently lived up to Schumpeter's worst fears. I was put off economics for life, not by you, John, but by Paul Samuelson, whose textbook may have been inflicted on you. I leafed through it as a schoolboy and saw that it predicted that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States in terms of gross national product. In the 1980s, I dismissed immediately macroeconomics as a subject. It clearly wasn't serious. But Samuelson consistently predicted that the Soviet Union would overtake the United States year after year after year, in every edition of that textbook, constantly putting off the year at which it would happen. In reality, the Soviet economy was never larger than 44% of the US economy at any point in the Cold War. So I take this as a starting point for an argument about why it was that prior to Schumpeter's time, socialism had in fact been the loser. It was in fact a great failure in the 19th century. And it's interesting to trace these words back to their origins. You probably didn't know that socialism as a word was coined before capitalism. We can trace socialism back to the 1820s. 1822 seems to be the first usage. Capitalism was first used as a term in 1833. British inventions, terms of the Industrial Revolution, and in the case of capitalism, always a pejorative term. In the case of socialism, generally speaking, a positive alternative to a market model. But Marx and Engels, who were relative latecomers to this nomenclature, made predictions that turned out to be wrong. Their core prediction that the iron law of wages would drive wages down to subsistence level and that capital would concentrate in the hands of fewer and fewer people, turned out to be wrong in the 19th century. And in fact, the capitalist economy needed workers to be consumers to function. So by the early 1900s, it had all failed. And even social democrats, as the Germans called themselves, were giving up on the fundamental predictions of Marxism. Secondly, nationalism just proved a more potent force, and nation states a more powerful organizing force than Marx and Engels had foreseen. So the paper makes the argument that the only reason socialism ever got a shot was that the 20th century world wars gave it a shot that the theories of Marx and Engels on their own never would have. It's the fact of the world wars that propels Lenin into power, that triggers revolutions in multiple countries. It's also the world wars that puts the state in control of the economy in a way that it was nowhere in the 19th century. But of course, all the predictions that were made by the likes of Hayek at the end of World War II, that if you tried to run a peacetime economy on the basis of state control and planning, you'd end up on the road to serfdom, those predictions ultimately proved correct. The Samuelsons were wrong, the Kornais, the Miseses, the Hayeks were right, and ultimately in my young day in the 1980s, the wheels came off the Soviet system, and it became apparent even to those who'd been taken in that the system couldn't possibly deliver. So it seemed all to be over. The question then is, why on earth, in our time, after all this history, has socialism made a comeback? And of all places, in the United States of America? Well, it's because Schumpeter's still right. The volatility, the economic destruction associated with the capitalism of the global financial crisis is part one of the answer. If you doubt that capitalism tends towards oligopoly and monopoly, come to Silicon Valley and take a walk with me. I'll show you the monopolies. The intellectuals are even further to the left, especially in the universities, than they were back in Schumpeter's day. And as per usual, there are politicians ready to spend other people's money, step forward Bernie Sanders and AOC. So in that sense, Schumpeter's explanation for the persistence of socialism still holds good. But let me conclude, because time is short, with a couple of observations. The only Americans who are persuaded of the superiority of socialism to capitalism are young Americans. That is to say, the youngest voters, the so-called Generation Z group, they're the ones who actually, in polls, say they prefer socialism to capitalism. But what do they mean by socialism? It's not fair to say that they think it's social media. That only a really small proportion of people make that error, though some do. The reality is that this generation thinks that socialism is what you find in Northern Europe. To be precise, in Scandinavia. AOC, in an interview with Anderson Cooper last year, explicitly referenced Norway, Finland, and Sweden. But the problem with Sweden as an ideal socialist economy is that it's anything but that. It's 9th in the World Economic Forum's competitiveness rankings, 12th in the World Bank's ease of doing business rankings, and even the Heritage Foundation puts it 19th in the world in terms of economic freedom. So this young generation of Americans is in the grip of a massive category error in that they think Scandinavia's highly competitive market economies are socialist. As I try to show in the paper, that's not right. They certainly do more redistribution through the fiscal system than the United States. But the United States does more redistribution through the fiscal system than Chile does. If you look at OECD countries, there's a spectrum. And we get to choose, through democracy, how much redistribution we want. It doesn't make you a socialist country to opt for somewhat more redistribution through the fiscal channel than the United States. The distinction that we need to draw the young generation's attention to is between states with the rule of law and and states without. The reason Sweden never became a truly socialist country was that it always retained the rule of law. And when they tried to expropriate Sweden's capitalists by giving power over equity to trade unions, that move was defeated. The truly socialist countries, beginning with the Bolshevik Revolution, differentiate themselves by the absence of rule of law and the lawless expropriation by one means or another of private property. That's the real essence of socialism. It has different outcomes, ranging from China to Venezuela. But what all those countries, including Cuba and North Korea, have in common, the truly socialist countries do not have the rule of law. And this, I conclude, was the thing that Schumpeter missed in his analysis. And it's the thing that I believe we need to emphasize more strongly. What really preserves capitalism and prevents socialism is the maintenance of the rule of law based on private property rights. That's why Sweden's not really socialist. When we talk about socialism, we should be pointing at countries where the rule of law does not exist. And I don't really mind whether your example is Venezuela or Cuba or China. That's the distinction that I think we need to make. Finally, can capitalism survive? Let me repose Schumpeter's question. Yes, I'm more optimistic than he was. Can socialism work? No, it never does. And if anybody tells you that it's working in China, I have a pandemic to sell you. So I'll conclude simply by saying, for A to be true, for capitalism to survive, it's crucial that the rule of law be upheld. It's absolutely integral to the success of the capitalist system. More important even than democracy, more important than nationalism. And that is why it is such a central part of what the Hoover Institution does. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Neil. Peter, on capitalism, socialism, and freedom.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here. I begin with two preliminaries. One, I'm duty-bound to announce that the opinions I'm about to utter on John Locke and Karl Marx do not necessarily reflect those of the United States government. And second, as you can see, when Neil confronts a moral, political, economic problem, his first instinct is to turn to history. When I confront such problems, my first step is to turn to the history of political philosophy. In this particular case, the two disciplines, the two kinds of study, result in roughly the same conclusions. So what's the issue? The way I encountered it is this way. I noticed that there is a fundamental distinction between capitalism and socialism. They differ in fundamental ways. In capitalism, the most important decisions about production, distribution, and consumption are made by private individuals. And the government protects a far-ranging right to private property. In socialism, the major decisions about production, consumption, and distribution are made by central authority, by government. And the right to private property is narrowly circumscribed if it's not outright abolished. It's a pretty big difference. But today, most people, many people, especially young people, I'd raise the age, under the age of 50, do not operate with really a sound understanding of either capitalism or socialism. And it's a funny thing. All the errors in their understanding tend to redound to the benefit of socialism. This is especially true, as Neil said, about young people. Polls from Harris and Gallup last year showed that the under 35s, by over 50%, would like to see more socialism in the American economy. Those under 50, almost half, thought it would be nice to live under a socialist regime rather than a capitalist regime. And as Neil pointed out, it's very important to keep in mind that what most people mean by socialism is not a full-blown command economy in which the right to private property is all but abolished, in which the government makes all the decisions. It's roughly a soft kind of progressivism in which the state is involved in more regulation and the state is involved in more redistribution. But as Hayek warned and warned brilliantly in the mid-1940s, socialism, the full-blown form, in which or almost all the major decisions are made by a central authority, it can sneak up on you indirectly, incrementally, and inadvertently. So it occurred to me that it would be very useful to take it occurred to me, prodded by Scott and Eddie, after prodded by them, it occurred to me it would be useful to undertake a kind of fresh examination of both a seminal statement of the principles of freedom, which undergird both liberal democracy and free market system in John Locke, and take a fresh look at the seminal critique of the principles of freedom in the writings of Karl Marx. That's what I sought to do in the paper I wrote for the series. So in the few minutes I have, let me offer a few observations about those fundamental principles that we find in Locke, their pertinence today, and Karl Marx's critique. His predictions were wrong, drastically wrong. But one item we have to explain is, why did Marx's writings exercise such fascination over so many people around the globe, and exercise so much power and so much influence? Terribly destructive, to be sure. So first let's begin with Locke. Locke writes his writing toward the end of the 17th century. His most famous political work is the Second Treatise. And in the Second Treatise, he takes on a narrowly defined problem, but it's also our problem. In Locke's age, divine right monarchy was becoming increasingly incredible. In the technical sense, it was harder and harder to accept the arguments that were offered for divine right monarchy. But there was also, when Locke was writing, no clear alternative. He said, if we cannot take seriously the claims that the king rules on the basis of a moral and legal claim that can be traced back to Adam, on what possible basis could we ground political legitimacy? Now, John Locke was not the first person to think that human beings are by nature free and equal. But he was among the very first to suggest that this premise, at once descriptive and moral, that human beings are by nature free and equal, is the principle of political legitimacy. That is, the power of government derived from the freedom and equality of individuals, and this freedom and equality was a standard for measuring the legitimacy of the government's rule. If it no longer was able to secure the rights shared equally by all, that government was no longer legitimate. Many of the ideas that are still with us can be found in Locke's Second Treatise and the theoretical underpinnings laid bare there, including the labor theory of property, which is also developed interestingly by Karl Marx. The idea of property, argues Locke, is grounded first and foremost in the property that we have in our own body and the connection between a transformation of the world through our energy, through our intellect, through our intention, and what becomes of that and the objects that we form. But for Locke, this right is an expression of human dignity and human freedom. We have we have property also in our basic rights. Jefferson provided a kind of Lockean summary of them. Life, liberty, Locke had said property. Jefferson said pursuit of happiness. He meant something similar. The larger idea is this. The principal purpose of political society, has subsidiary purposes, is to protect these essential rights. How does political society protect these essential rights, political and economic? It protects it through a constitutional framework that creates a system for legislating general settled laws, for enforcing the laws fairly, and for adjudicating the controversies that arise under the law. The legal system must be limited, and is limited by the rights that we all share. There is a point at which the system becomes illegitimate, not if you disagree with this or that law, because of course you have consented to the general framework for making laws. But if the entire government becomes destructive of freedom, then it ceases to be legitimate. Locke said this would be very rare. Jefferson repeated 100 years later in the Declaration, 90 years later, that it would be very rare. But such was the case, argued Jefferson and those who signed the Declaration in 1776. One more quick comment about John Locke for those of you who follow these controversies. You know, in some conservative circles over the last couple of years, Locke has become a target. He's become a target because he supposedly did not appreciate the importance of community in a political order, because he put forward an abstract understanding of reason, because he was a narrow-minded Enlightenment thinker that did not understand the national spirit, and so on. All of these criticisms, I think, are mistaken because they misunderstand Locke's purpose, which was to give an account of political legitimacy, not to deny the other dimensions of political life. It's up to us to supply an account of the role of community, the role of the virtues, the role of education, and so on. What about Karl Marx? More than a century later, Marx comes on the scene, and in a very important respect, Marx actually shares a Lockean premise. This is one of the reasons that Marx's critique exercised such power in the Western world. Marx doesn't quite put it this way, but I do think it accurately captures his thinking. Marx assumed also that human beings are by nature free and equal. And his argument was that 19th century political society, by its very nature, liberal democracy, couldn't do justice to the freedom and the equality we shared. He generalized from his perceptions of factory life in 19th century England incorrectly, in my estimation. Moreover, Marx had a dogmatic view about ideas. It was part of Marx's theory. Here he departed from Locke, suggesting all the ideas that dominate in political life are themselves not independent, but are rooted in and reflect the manner in which we provide for our daily substance. They reflect the economic modes of production. Ideas are not independent. John Locke speaks of rights. Well, what are rights? Rights are one of the vehicles. What is consent? Consent is one of the vehicles. What is religious toleration? One of the vehicles by which those who prosper in society protect their, we would say today, unearned privilege. Marx was also a utopian. Marx characterized the freedom that liberal democracy provides as political emancipation. We say terrific. Marx said that was terrible. In liberal democracy, private property is protected. That allows people to have wicked thoughts in the privacy of their home. Moreover, it allows people to practice the religion that they embrace. And religion is the opium of the masses, yet another way in which ordinary people are enslaved. Marx sought what he called human emancipation. Human emancipation would emancipate us also from religion, from private property. Famously, as you know, Marx envisaged a communist society in which each would give according to his or her abilities, each would receive according to his or her needs. You only need to think about that for a moment to understand the connection, the deep connection between Marx's thought and the totalitarian nightmares of the 20th century. What would it take for a government to determine what each of us is capable of giving? And what would it take for a government to determine what the needs are of each one of us? well, this would involve lofty insight into the human soul, and it would involve virtually limitless power on the part of the government. And again, the 20th century shows us in practice what happens when government arrogates to itself such colossal responsibilities and prerogatives. I will conclude with just a few brief remarks about elaborating on this idea of why communism fared so poorly and why liberal democracy has, by any fair estimation, prospered. One of Marx's great errors was to drastically underestimate, actually I should say simply deny, the extraordinary self-correcting powers of capitalism and liberal democracy. Because we're free societies, we have the opportunity for criticism, for innovation, for entrepreneurship, for challenging the status quo. We have enacted all sorts of laws to ameliorate the conditions that Marx deplored and to a significant extent rightly deplored from the 19th century. Communism, which I should have mentioned, was the most influential form of socialism, also was dogmatic in its theory of history, about which Neil spoke. I've already mentioned it was utopian. By contrast, liberal democracy is not grounded in some extravagant philosophy of history. It's grounded in a realistic assessment of human beings, a realistic assessment of the role of self-interest in human life, and an appreciation that self-interest is not everything. Human beings are capable sometimes of rising above self-interest. Narrowly understood, we are capable of cultivating the virtues, but nevertheless, out of still a kind of distrust, we limit government because we think, in this important sense, we're all equal. All of us, given power, will be liable to abuse it, so we pay a great deal of attention to limiting government, so those who exercise power won't abuse it, and to give as wide a possible play to individuals' initiative and choice, as Locke said, their rationality and industriousness. I'll finish with one final comment. We began with, in a way Neil and I both began with the observation that capitalism and socialism are not well understood these days. One of the reasons they're not well understood, Neil asked, why today? Because our universities are doing such a poor job of teaching economic history, the history of political philosophy. Our students are neither receiving the basic facts about history, about these two very different systems. They're also, in my judgment, not adequately having independence of mind cultivated by their professors. So if we are to effectively make the case for freedom, understand the distinction between capitalism and socialism, and, in my judgment, work to preserve both free markets and political freedom, what we especially need to do is work on the reform of our universities. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. John, you recently published a book, Choose Economic Freedom, with Secretary George Shultz, and you have some lessons from Milton Friedman. Can you talk to us, and also your plans for your paper on this project?
Well, thank you. So this, what Aaron's referring to is this little book, which I'm very proud. I'm in the middle of George Shultz and Milton Friedman. What a better position could one be in? And we called it Choose Economic Freedom. And it makes the case about why we should choose economic freedom. And I think of economic freedom as having essential characteristics. The first, which I always mention, is what Neil mentioned, the rule of law, essential. But there's other things. Predictable policy, I think, is important. I think emphasis on markets and the prices are important. I think incentives of individuals, you can't ignore those, is another part of economic freedom. And I think a limited role of government in some ways. So I've mentioned 5 things as my definition of economic freedom, very, very specific. But socialism, in some sense, is the opposite of all those, right? It's that instead of rule of law, you have government decrees. Who cares about predictable policy? We'll do what we want. Markets, we'll just set prices from the center. Incentives, incentives don't matter. And limits on government, are you kidding? So I think it's useful to think about the contrast. I didn't really use the word capitalism specific. It's economic freedom, which is maybe another way to go about it. Now, it's not easy to choose economic freedom. That's one of the lessons from this history in this book. In the 50s and 60s, people talking about all sorts of things. In fact, as Neil and Peter both mentioned, the Mount Pelerin Society was founded to confront a lot of that. We had a meeting just last month at Hoover. It's 40 years ago we had a meeting in Mount Pelerin at Hoover. We had another one. Neil presented a terrific paper. And we talked about this book too. So it's been challenges that had existed for a while. In the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of this. And one of the things that we have in this book about George's amazing experience, there was a memo written by Arthur Burns, distinguished, pretty much free market economist, to Nixon saying the world is different. That's not economic freedom. It was a disaster. The 70s had higher inflation, high unemployment. I worked in the White House for President Ford. His solution was to wear a button called Whip Inflation Now. Win. And in a joint session of Congress, he gave a speech, so we were part of that. We're unwinding it, but it didn't last forever. And it was a dramatic change in philosophy. And there's changes back again now, and that's why we're having this important discussion, why the issues are there, because once again, the issues are being raised. And I think that in many respects, and you heard a little about that from Peter and Neil, we can learn from the last confrontation. Talk about students. I teach freshmen, hundreds. They don't know about the Soviet Union. They weren't even born. I had to tell the stories, well, the commissar said produce 500 pounds of nails, they produced one big 500-pound nail. Stories like that, we need those kinds of stories. I mentioned, a lot of talk about the very reputable Business Roundtable. Last September, they came in with a view that we should not care just about stockholders, about a lot of other people. That's quite a change from statements written as long ago as 1979. So I think we need to teach history. Milton Friedman wrote the introduction to Hayek's Road to Serfdom, the 50th anniversary introduction, and he emphasized how it was more relevant than ever. I think it's more relevant now than even when he wrote the introduction in 1994, 50 years after it was published. I think that there's a sense in which the way we're approaching things, it has to do with computers, or changing things. So a student came in the other day, Professor, why do I need to take economics anymore? We can allocate people to the best jobs, the best things through artificial intelligence and big data. Don't worry about it. Well, I need to teach better. I mean, this is not working if that's what they think. So that's another aspect that I think is changing. But once again, I just found this amazing op-ed Milton wrote in 1994. It was called, Once Again, Why Socialism Won't Work. I'd read it. It's a quote from it. The bulk of the intellectual community almost automatically favors any expansion of government power. They may have learned the words, but they don't yet have the tune. I think that rings true. Now, there's a lot of things that we can be talking about. There's new data. They already mentioned some of the indices of economic freedom from Heritage Fraser. The World Bank has a doing business. These are kind of big data which we can use. And when I look at those data, you see differences in performance in economies which are quite striking. And we had representatives of all those people at Hoover just last month to talk about it. So that's what I say. We've done this before. Of course the world's different, not the same. I don't think we need to have new theories, quite frankly. Damn theories are good. But we need to articulate in a way that is relevant. And let me just conclude. I think even if we removed these kind of obstacles that we're all talking about, it's really hard to move in practice. It's the ideas and the action. And they're both important. And we're thinking about ideas a lot, but the actions are very important. Even if we removed all the obstacles, we'd have to find a way to work in practice. Again, let me quote Milton again, who's one of the co-authors. This is not from the book, but he said this as well. It is only a little overstated to say that we preach individualism and competitive capitalism and practice socialism. So I think to get the job done, we need to be clear about what's going on as best we can. Examples, history are very important. History of thought, history of what actually happened. Explain them and, quite frankly, fight for them. Thank you.
Thank you, John. In our last 15 minutes, we will open it up to questions from the audience.
Continuing with this theme about technology, does the rise of the digital economy, really basically this sort of new digital world that people exist in, sometimes separately from the real world, and how that interacts, does that change the dynamics of the sort of capitalism versus socialism debate, or is it still the same as it's always been?
Go ahead, Neil.
Well, I've seen Chinese economists claim that AI makes the planned economy possible. There was a paper published a year or two ago making that argument. And I think that's going to turn out to be a grand illusion. Indeed, I think the entire project of resuscitating totalitarianism with facial recognition technologies, surveillance, and big data and AI will fail as completely as a total surveillance state failed in the German Democratic Republic. They didn't have AI, but they had total surveillance, and it didn't save Erich Honecker. So I think one of the grand illusions of our time is that somehow there's totalitarianism 2.0 in China. But I think you ask a valid question about the rest of the world, because you don't need to have read a lot of cyberpunk literature to realize that we're actually entering a world rather like Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash, where young people spend a rising proportion of their time in a parallel world, online, with avatars inhabiting cyberspace. If you're not doing it, I guarantee your children or grandchildren are, to a much larger extent than you can imagine. What's fascinating to me about the parts of the world where that culture's most developed is that the market economy is alive and well in cyberspace. If you go to South Korea, which I think is the most advanced form of game cyberspace, it's an economic system that is far more capitalist than it is socialist. The only thing that currently doesn't happen is the tokens that you can earn in cyberspace can't easily be transferred into the real world and converted into local currency, but that will come. So I'm actually quite optimistic that what's going on if you like, in free cyberspace outside of China looks a lot more like capitalism than it looks like socialism.
So I'm a little more worried than Neil. It's from teaching and talking to freshmen who do come up with these questions. The most popular major at Stanford is computer science. It used to be economics. There is a sense in which I think we need to teach our economics better. It's not just prediction. It's explaining why things happen. It's because this particular method works better. And I think we need to worry about it. We need to deal with it. Right now, there's so much power from the prediction. Anywhere you go, there's Google, but there's very little theory. We have one of our colleagues, Susan Athey, is trying to find ways to bring in some basic economics into the data analysis. I think we need to stress that more, and then we'll be able to convince people more.
Peter?
Just add to this. So I share John's worries, although I think that Neil is right that the project of an AI-driven governed economy is actually it's nightmarish. What do I mean? Think back again to Marx's formula, from each according to his abilities to each according to his needs. To carry that out, you need to understand two items perfectly. One, the character of each individual soul and what justice is. And I've seen not a shred of evidence that artificial intelligence is capable of, for all of its vast powers, capable of understanding either the complexities of the human soul or the requirements of justice. So it won't succeed But with John, I fear that more and more people are subject to the illusion that it could, and that's extremely dangerous.
Eddie?
I think the nature of your question was focused primarily on the allocation role of prices. And your argument was once we have computers that can allocate people and goods and services effectively, we don't need prices. Even if that were true, and I think it's a long shot and it's a long time for us to get there, there's another role of prices, and that is to motivate people. So one of the things I think that people forget when they're thinking about AI is that even if AI could solve the allocation problem, it doesn't solve the motivation problem, and I think that's the essence of what we have to worry about.
Oh, thank you. My name is Karl Pulzer, and I have a project called the Center on Capital and Social Equity. So I'm trying to analyze inequality and include more people in the capitalist economy, like 401ks for everybody, everybody in a healthcare plan. I just think when I read Hayek, I read that he leaves room for social insurance and pockets of social insurance to help support a capitalist free market economy. For example, Chapter 9, and this is going to end up being a question. Hayek says, whereas in the case of sickness and accident, neither the desire to avoid such calamities nor the efforts to overcome the consequences are as a rule weakened by the provision of assistance, government assistance, where in short we deal with genuinely insurable risks, the case for the states helping to organize a comprehensive system of social insurance is very strong. There is no incompatibility in principle between the states providing greater security in this way and the preservation of individual freedom. So there's a way to work together, these forces. Does that resonate? I mean, it seems like too black and white here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's actually closer to my topic, I think, than the one that we covered today, and we're not quite there, but let me give you a preview. The way I would answer your question is this. It's certainly true that having social insurance and having redistribution is a way to affect the welfare, particularly of the poorest individuals in society. But the most important fact, the most important data point, I've already studied this in my paper, is that only wealthy societies can afford to do that. So if you look at redistribution and you ask how much redistribution is done by the poorer countries in the world, the answer is almost none. It's only the very wealthy societies that can afford to do it. And so the question is, how do you get wealthy? And the way you get wealthy is by having an economy that's conducive to growth. So one of the things that you have to worry about is if you engage in massive redistribution, very large government expenditures, what does that do to growth? And just to give you a preview of it, we know those effects are negative. So there's a trade-off. Even if you were able to accomplish what you're talking about in the short run, it does have long-run dynamic implications.
Can I add, I like your question a lot because it reminds us that Hayek was not a complete absolutist opponent of the state, and nor should any right-thinking conservative or classical liberal be. It was in the late 19th century that Bismarck introduced the first social insurance in Germany so that the poor elderly would have some kind of provision in old age. Lloyd George later adopted something similar in the UK. None of this is incompatible with a successful free market economy. It's all about preventing these initial ideas of social insurance from growing inexorably in the way that they began to in the 1930s, then the 1960s and 70s, to create the modern administrative state with its massive and highly inefficient system of redistribution. So I think it's good to remind ourselves that it's not black and white. It's not possible to create a libertarian paradise in which the state plays no role, and Hayek never argued for that. It's about creating limited government in which you use that kind of social insurance where it's appropriate, not making it universal. And it's the aspiration to create universal schemes of benefit and universal redistribution with very high levels of progressive taxation, which we know from history always kills growth and ultimately breaks down and ends either in inflation or in depression.
Peter and then John.
And it's not only, as Neil suggests, not black and white in theory, it's not black and white in practice. You cannot find a liberal democracy on the planet that doesn't provide some kind of social insurance, some state-sponsored vehicles for caring for the poor, the ill, the elderly, and so on. And indeed, the distinction between social democracy and the United States is sometimes overblown. There are important differences, but both sets of liberal democracies provide that support. One other quick observation, you can see this already, believe it or not, in the thinking of John Locke in Chapter 6 of the second treatise. He takes on a theoretical problem. He says, education is the obligation of parents before the era of public schools. The purpose of education is to prepare young men, he says also daughters, women, for freedom. Then he confronts a problem. What happens if the child becomes an orphan? Locke says, it becomes the obligation of the state to provide a tutor. Not saying that John Locke is the father of the welfare state. But what I am suggesting is this, Locke also gives us a criterion, I think consistent with Neil's observations, for understanding where the state goes too far. What is the purpose of education, parents' education for Locke, but also the state? To prepare young men and women for freedom. When the social safety net, and this is, I think, also entirely consistent with Hayek's argument, when the social safety net serves the interests of freedom, we should support it. But it can easily, for reasons Neil mentioned, actually, when it expands too far, undercut freedom by inducing dependency. In those cases, we should be critics of it.
John.
So one thing I just want to make sure isn't forgotten is this economic freedom doesn't mean just for some, it means for all. And a lot of the problems that I think you are thinking we should fix in some way, they're better remedies. Education is not equal. The poverty rate in California is the highest in America. I was in San Francisco last night, drove home, I almost wanted to cry. The streets are covered with people. I think it's the worst it's ever been. So we got to do something about this. To me, it's the same methods will work. Education, free up, make sure the kids in the worst areas have the benefits and any opportunities. But I think, to me, it's these problems need to be fixed. And a lot of it is getting more information about how many are vets, how many really have other kinds of problems we don't know. But that's a real concern to me, and it drives you crazy when you just see what's going on. Anyway, I just wanted to say that. Mm-hmm.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat. Of course, a capital system depends on a steady medium of exchange. And now we see increasingly digital currencies, which are attempting to bypass all the regulations of all the currencies in the world. To my mind, this is the greater fool theory in action. But I could be wrong. I mean, Venezuela is thinking about establishing a digital currency to replace the paper, which is now worthless. When you guys look at the future of capitalism, in which cryptocurrencies are growing at substantial rates, and even Rick Edelman has an investment in those things, do you see the Dutch tulip crisis, or are we all, as national entities, going to switch to cryptocurrencies?
Neil, I think you've been
Yes.
looking at this.
I always hesitate to talk about anything involving money when John Taylor's on the same stage, but I'll offer a few thoughts and then John can weigh in because he's really the expert here. It depends what you mean, because there are a bunch of different things currently being piloted. Bitcoin's more than 10 years old now. Rumors of its death have proved exaggerated, but it would be wrong to think of Bitcoin as a successful substitute for money. What Bitcoin has become is a successful digital asset, which has some of the properties of gold in portfolios. It's a kind of option on digital gold, and I don't think it'll go away. Well, the thing about Bitcoin is its finite supply creates a sort of likely persistence which it wouldn't have if you could produce Bitcoin ad nauseam. I'd be skeptical if you told me that Bitcoin would go to zero under those circumstances given its design. The same isn't true of most other cryptocurrencies, which are highly likely to end up as worth nothing in dollar terms. But there's also a quite different experiment going on in China, which is electronic payment connected to the Chinese banking system and therefore effectively in RMB, a non-convertible currency. But because of the convenience of electronic payment through Alipay and WeChat Pay, not only China but the rest of the world, not including the United States, are very rapidly adopting this kind of payment architecture. That's much more important than Bitcoin, because what's currently happening is that volumes of transactions on Chinese platforms are soaring. And that, to my mind, poses a much more profound threat to a dollar-based system going back to post-Bretton Woods in the 1970s that is looking kind of superannuated in many ways, and which the United States has been really making the most of through the financial sanctions channel for the better part of the last 20 years. The rest of the world is highly incentivized to find means of payment that the United States cannot control. So those who see the dollar's dominance as something likely to be eternal haven't learned from history. I spent part of this afternoon writing a paper about the lessons for the United States from the decline and fall of sterling. If there's one thing that's really clear to me, it is that losing the edge in financial technology is the biggest mistake a superpower can make. And my great fear, and I've said it in this town to people in high places, is that we are too complacent about the way in which we are falling behind in the most elementary financial technology, to the point that we are now the conservative power in fintech. The innovation is happening elsewhere, and the US is, I think, increasingly lagging behind. We love our fiat system. When you say to people at the Fed or at the Treasury, hey, I've got this great idea for an electronic currency that could be used globally, it's called Libra, their response is to throw up. Now, you can say that anything that Facebook suggests will make people in this town throw up, and that might well be justified. But if our basic stance is, no, we don't do innovation here, we love the system that we came up with in the 1970s when George Shultz was in government, then I think we have a problem. So I think it's much more important to focus on Chinese digital payment platforms than to worry about Bitcoin, much less Ethereum or any of the other cryptocurrencies. John?
Well, I think I agree with all that you said. I don't know what to add. I would say there is a concern that the powers that be will tend to squeeze out the innovation. I think Neil's referring to that to some extent. I think the fintech has a huge potential because it gets away from a lot of the unnecessary regulation. I wish there was more of that. But I think at this point, you don't want the central banks to try to squeeze out something that could be more promising, and especially in some countries. And I think that's a tendency to do, oh, we can't have this alternative because we'll lose control of the system. I think a better way would be to find a way to make this new system work even better. And that's going to come through innovators and thinking, how do you maintain some kind of stability of the currency? Bitcoin, of course, fluctuates all over the place. Is it backing? Is it having a price change according to supply and demand? So I think those things are promising. Some firms are thinking about it. But I think it would be not a good system if we try to squeeze this out. Or the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, tries to squeeze it out.
It's worth adding, John, and I wonder if you agree with me when I say this, that it's not just self-confessed socialists who yearn for economic planning. I'm really struck by how technocrats in the supposedly capitalist countries, including at central banks, have the instincts of planners if they've been in the job for long enough. And you'll probably have noticed that some central bankers have suddenly become responsible for climate change, as well as price stability. And doubtless they're responsible for corporate governance, gender balance, and who knows what else. But this impulse to plan isn't confined to self-conscious socialists. It's actually embedded in most state bureaucracies. And I'm quite worried by the fact that it's prevalent now at central banks, who really should have a much more narrow mandate than that.
So just quickly, we have a conference every year at Hoover on central banking, and we're trying to be constructively critical. We're saving the green technology till next year. We got enough on our hands right now.
With that, we are unfortunately out of time for the evening. I can't thank you enough for joining us. We will be rolling out these papers about every 6 to 8 weeks. As Scott said, we have about 25 scholars that will be publishing. We have a list of all the authors, as well as the first 2 papers, and Choose Economic Freedom on the front table. Be looking for programming here in this DC office. We'll be doing these types of public forums, roundtables, conferences, different types. And we also, for those of you who are here from California that have joined us, please look for more programming at Stanford. With that, thank you very much.
Sorry, I got a terrible question.